Hello, you're listening to Conversing the Classics. Today we're discussing the 6th century AD Roman historian known for his major works of history on the reign of Justinian I. His Anecdota, also known as the Secret History, provides us with a very different insight into the imperial dynasty. Joining me today to discuss the life and work of Roman historian Procopius is Christopher Lillington-Martin, editor of Procopius of Caesarea, Literary and Historical Interpretations, which is going to be published by Routledge in 2017, classics teacher at Summerfield's School in Oxford and researcher at the Oxford Centre for Late Antiquity and a part-time PhD student at the University of Reading. That's a mouthful. Christopher, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for the invitation.
So I suppose to open the discussion, do we have much biographical information surrounding Procopius's early life and what he achieved prior to writing his histories?
Well, we have some, but inevitably not as much as we'd like. We know that he was born in Caesarea, in what is now Israel, as Palestine as was, in the southeast of the Mediterranean. It was a huge, very important port, and we have to deduce more things about his early life because he doesn't actually tell us. There's been, several theories, and I won't go into all of them, but one possibility is that he seems to have had, from comments he makes later on in his writing, he seems to have had some kind of connections with the merchant class and possibly with the senatorial class too. He seems to have studied law. We don't know exactly where, quite possibly in the same region. And as for what he achieved prior to his writings, well, he spent about 15 years, roughly 15 years, attached to probably the most famous and successful general of the day, General Belisarius. He was his advisor for about 15 years. And so he was working as a legal advisor to this general as the general went on campaign all around the eastern and central Mediterranean.
And then obviously he was quite close with Justinian, the imperial family. How did he get that close? Do we know, or is that just up in the air, or was it through Belisarius?
Well, really, I'd say it's probably through Belisarius. I mean, he really became close to Belisarius because he was on campaign. I mean, when Belisarius was sent to the east or North Africa and Procopius was with him, he was, on campaign, and he was a fairly close advisor for all sorts of little, anecdotes he tells us. And it seems that in around about 542, Belisarius fell from grace for a year or so. And at that point, a lot of his friends were apparently forbidden to associate with him. And this may have included Procopius, we don't really know. But that would mean that if that were the case, that Procopius had from about 542 onwards to basically turn his memories and access to other information into history.
Now, obviously, moving on to talk sort of about what makes him famous, his work. Does it all survive, or is he like most ancient historians where we have only a fraction of it?
It's very difficult to know. I'd suggest probably most of it survives. With the Secret History, it seems that sometimes he took parts of that. It was as if he was keeping a secret file in parallel to his main history, which was to be published. And there are some examples where it seems that he moved information from the secret file into the public file before it was published because the person he was talking about had just died. So he couldn't write ill of the living. He could write ill of the dead. So there's that aspect to it. The other thing is that he does at one point in his history suggest that he's going to write something about religion. And as far as we know, he never actually did that. So he may have done it and it doesn't survive. Or it has also been suggested that it may be within a part of the Secret History. So a long answer to a short question. I suppose the short answer is probably most of it survives, but we can't be 100% sure.
Yeah. And then obviously the main book, which is the Wars of Justinian, I think it's called. What campaigns and battles are narrated in it?
Okay, well, effectively the most important ones of the early 6th century. He starts off when he's just been appointed to advisor to Belisarius out on the eastern frontier in what is now eastern Turkey-Syria border in about 527. And then he explains some of the sort of border skirmishes that were going on in the late 20s. And then this leads to a fairly significant battle called the Battle of Dara in 530, which Belisarius won, defeating the Persian invaders. And then in the following year, the Persians invade again, and Belisarius goes south and they have another battle outside a city which used to be called Canonicum, which is now called Rakar, which people would have heard about in the news. At that point, Belisarius was actually defeated in battle. At least he was defeated on the field of battle. The Persians still withdrew, so you could perhaps call it a tactical defeat, but a strategic victory because the Persians did go away. Mm-hmm. I should mention that in between those two battles in late 530, there was another battle in eastern Turkey where neither Procopius nor Belisarius were present, where Persians invaded, and another general called Sitas, he defeated them, the Persians withdrew. So the Persians attacked through northern Mesopotamia in early summer of 530 at Dara. Then they tried at Satala, in slightly further north. And the following Easter, they tried at Canonicum in 531. So the result of those battles were basically stalemate, and actually led approximately a year later, in 532, to a so-called endless peace between the Romans and the Persians, between Justinian and the Persian king, which meant that both monarchs were free to deploy their forces in other areas. So the Persians could concentrate on other frontiers north and their eastern frontiers, and Justinian could turn his forces to go southwest towards Africa and eventually west to Italy and even further west eventually to Spain.
I see. Now, we're talking all about Belisarius, and that's all well and good. Could you just maybe give context to those who don't know who he was and what's his significance, sort of the broader historical context?
Well, Belisarius was born around about 500. Again, we don't know that exactly. He seems to have risen up in the ranks as Justinian was rising up in the imperial court, and when Justinian became emperor, Belisarius got promoted. He originally came from somewhere called, now called Sapareva or Germania in southwest Bulgaria. He, as I say, was appointed first on the eastern frontier, did relatively well, and then was chosen as the man to lead the invasion against North Africa to defeat the Vandals from 533. So Belisarius is pretty significant. I mean, there were other generals, and we do get a bit of a skewed view of the generals in the 6th century, because what we know about Belisarius is basically mostly what Procopius tells us. There are a couple of other historians. Gaethius, for example, he tells us some things. And there's one historian or writer, Marcellinus Comes, who wrote a work who talked about the conquest of North Africa and didn't even mention Belisarius once, whereas his continuator mentioned Belisarius 20-something times. So there was bias in all of these writers, as you'd expect to some degree. So most of what we know about Belisarius comes from Procopius. So it's really Procopius's Belisarius that we know most about.
Now, the Wars of Justinian is sort of written in these 7 volumes, these 7 books. But later on, Procopius adds an 8th book to the volume. What events does it narrate, and why do you think he added it?
Right. Basically, it's an update. The first 7 books are divided up into 2 books on the Persian Wars. So he talks about the Persian Wars. He gives a background back into at least, I think, the 5th century. And he takes it up to about 550-ish. He does something similar with the 3rd and 4th book, with or otherwise known as the Vandal Wars. Goes back to when the Vandals invading Africa in the early 5th century, and then he explains the conquest from 533, 534, which is quite lucky and quick conquest, has to be said. And then books 5, 6, 7 are the Gothic War, which is effectively what happened in Italy, Sicily and Italy. And that's all taken up to around about 550. And then a couple of years later, it's difficult to date these precisely, but around about 553-ish, he adds an 8th book. And what he really does is he tries to do a roundup of things that have happened in all of those areas in the few years between having published those first 7 books. So it's an update.
Now, moving on to kind of the one that's the most famous, and it's the only one I've read, I have to confess. And I think it's the only one most people have read because of the subject matters in it. Yeah. What exactly is The Secret History, and why is it so famous? Why is it his most famous work?
Well, why is it most famous? Well, because it's got the word secret in the title, and it's got certain stories in it about the sexual exploits of the what was to become the Empress Theodora in it. So it does attract attention. But it's only about 10% of his actual writing. It's been divided up into about 3 sections. And really what it does is it turns on its head a lot of what Procopius has said in the wars that gets published publicly. But surprisingly, there are things that he doesn't include there. For example, in his public wars, in the Persian wars, in the first book, he says that Belisarius did well at this Battle of Callinicum, which was really a tactical defeat. And other historians, such as Malalas, say that Belisarius lost it. And the secret history would have been an ideal place for Procopius to have actually put the knife in and could have said that Belisarius had done really badly at that battle. He didn't do it. So it's a bit difficult to define exactly what the secret history is. It's not a bad idea to think of it in terms of a secondary, separate file of information which he selected from and dropped sections into his public history as far as he could.
So you don't think he ever intended to publish it? He just sort of notes or a research archive, if you like.
The thing is, I mean, if, for example, some of these protagonists had died, so, for example, Justinian nearly died of the plague in 542. That was at the very beginning, probably the very beginning of Procopius's writing of any kind, possibly slightly before it even happened. He would have written a very different story, secret or public, had Justinian died in 542. There is some evidence that there may have been some plots to assassinate Justinian in around about 550. So it has been suggested that perhaps the secret history would have been incorporated into the public history had that happened. So really, it seems that he would have deployed more of the information which he kept in the secret history. He would have deployed more of it had he been able to. One of the things he says in the secret history is that he feared for his life, and if he was discovered, he and his family would be killed. So he expresses the need specifically not to make it public.
So it was a very, very private thing, because he obviously didn't want, he didn't want it getting out. But then I suppose it was never published in his lifetime. How was it that it came to be published posthumously?
Well, there's a reference to it in the Suda, which is a 10th or 11th century encyclopedia of Byzantine or late Eastern Roman writing. It gets mentioned there. Surprisingly, his 10th book, The Buildings, all about the things that Justinian supposedly built, from forts to churches, etc., doesn't seem to get mentioned there. And then it's been sort of underground or more or less unknown, approximately from the middle of the 6th century until approximately around about 1100. And then it seems to go underground again, and it doesn't surface again until I think it's found in the Vatican Library. I forget the date, something around 1600 or thereabouts, 1604.
Oh, quite a almost.
Oh, yes. I mean, we're talking centuries, aren't we? So it gets found and then it gets published. And in fact, in the 17th century, up until possibly even 19th, 20th centuries, a lot of people didn't believe that the same author could have written both the published history, the secret history, and the buildings. Some people thought it was at least 2, possibly 3 authors. Yeah. But it has been now fairly conclusively.
And that's something that I just want to check. Given the distance of time, I mean, we're nearly 1,000 years. But is that right, or have I just completely miscalculated?
1,000 or 1,500. It was 500 years between.
Yeah. Given the distance of time between his death and its publication, how is it that it was managed to be verified as his work? How can we be sure that someone didn't forge it?
Well, he basically cross-references himself constantly. So within the secret history, he will say, I said such and such a story in the published history, but this is what really happened. And he cross-references himself throughout. And I think also the style of Greek is telling. So, as I say, there used to be people that thought it was written possibly by a different author, but I think that today it's well established that it is his.
I think we kind of addressed this one earlier, but I suppose just to revisit it. Why did he write the secret history? I mean, what do you think compelled him to sit down and say, I'm going to write down all these nasty things, despite the fact that I'm still quite openly writing this?
Well, I think the thing is about this is that it's unusual in that it survived in any form at all, because it's quite possible that other famous ancient, what we consider to be now famous ancient historians, whether it's Josephus, Tacitus, whoever, they may well have kept some kind of information, whether they consider it a secret file or not. It's fairly likely that, any historian, even today, they'll have, an X amount of information. They won't put it all into their published material. What's unusual and I'm not sure it's unique, but it's certainly unusual about Procopius, is that we do have these two separate, though parallel, accounts. And that is something that makes him a particularly interesting author. He wrote it, I suppose, because he wanted to keep information back so that if it became politically possible to publish it, he would have done. Some of it was possible, some of it wasn't. The example that's often given is John the Cappadocian. Yeah. He fell from grace, and therefore it seems that Procopius could move his information on him from his secret history to his publisher.
And I just want to verify that. When did he die, and when did people like Justinian die? I mean, was he...
Okay, well, we know the answer to Justinian is much easier. That was 565, November. Preceded not only 6 months before, in March 565, by Belisarius. As for Procopius, we don't actually know. Some people maintain that he survived into 565, others the late 550s, others mid-550s.
So, in other words, he didn't live long enough that it was possible to publish the document after the death of Justinian?
Certainly not. We don't. No, it seems that the latest parts of the main wars, the published wars, date from about 553-4, depending on which part of the empire we're talking about. And it's very difficult to date. Even there are some things in his buildings which might persuade us to date his writing to the late 550s, but it's very, very difficult. The fact that his published history seems to stop around about 553-4, the secret history files seem to as well. The buildings material it's arguable whether it's mid or late 550s. If I were a betting man, I would say he probably died 554-5, but that is not proven.
Does he not, and this could be me misremembering it, it's been about a year or two since I've read it, does he not talk about the death of Justinian in the secret history, something about the devil cackling in the cathedral, or is that, have I put that?
I can't remember off the top of my head. He talks about a lot of things in secret history. He talks about Justinian wandering around the imperial palace with his head under his arm, I believe, as a demon, amongst other things. He may have, there are certain things, I suppose, if you read between the lines, certainly the secret history, there are parts where Procopius probably wished Justinian had died.
Yeah.
But I don't think he goes quite so far as to say that he had.
And then this brings me into the second question. I suppose it's kind of already been answered by the fact he says he's walking around the palace with his head under his arm. Can we take the secret history as a verifiable historical document, or is it merely a piece of anti-imperial propaganda?
A bit of both. As I said, it's divided up into three parts. There are some parts which you could see transferred from it into the published history, and other parts are just so what we would consider to be fanciful that he's sort of letting off steam, I suppose. So there are parts which could go into the public history. There are parts which just are not, well, they're just impossible. Some of the things he says about Justinian are just impossible. So we have to consider each part on its own merits. I don't think we can consider the secret history as a whole and then write it off completely or validate it completely. I think we have to look at each element separately.
And then just sort of to put one in there, you were talking about his writings about the buildings of Justinian. Is this just kind of a list of buildings, or is there kind of history in there? I mean, what exactly is it?
Well, it starts off with a description of one of the most famous cathedrals in Christendom, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, Istanbul, as is, which is now a museum, and describes that in great detail. And then the buildings do turn into a bit of a list. And again, you see, that's, as I understand it, the buildings has been dated. There are two recensions to this. One's been dated to about 552-3, I think, and the other one to maybe 554. So again, that work seems to have finished around about the same time as the later parts of the published history of the wars. So they may have just stopped, and it may be that he wanted to work up his lists into more elaborate descriptions, but he didn't for whatever reason. That reason could be death. Mm-hmm. It could be, there could be lots of reasons, but he didn't do it. The buildings does seem to be an unfinished work.
Yeah. Okay. And then to bring it all together at the end, the question that nobody likes because it's always difficult is, if there were only three things I could take away from this podcast about Procopius and his secret history, and his historical works as a whole, what would you like them to be?
Well, I'd read his secret history last. I'd read his history first, and I would look for elements of his own biography, because we mentioned at the start, we know very little about his life, and we know that he studied law and became an advisor, and he worked for about 15 years alongside this general. But the interesting thing that I find about him is that within his history, he does something which most ancient historians don't do, or they don't do very much, which is he actually tells you what he did during the events. So he tells you that it was his idea to do certain things, such as how to give signals to parts of the army using certain types of trumpet made of certain materials, and that this helped at a siege in northern Italy in about 538-9. He even writes his own speech that he says that he said to the general Belisarius, and that he adopted the idea and then made another speech to the army, and that this was followed up. He talks about, on the invasion of Africa in 533, arriving there, and when they get into Carthage, him being one of the most important people that sits down and has the lunch that had been actually prepared for the Vandal king. He sort of gives you information about what he's done. He even has his sort of James Bond moment when, en route to North Africa in Sicily, he explains that he bumps into an old friend from Caesarea in Palestine, and this old friend's slave has just come back from Carthage. Has got vital information. So he basically kidnaps this slave, jumps on his ship, goes back to Belisarius to give all the vital information, which then leads to an unopposed landing in North Africa and the victory. So he's an interesting writer. To recap, read the Wars first and think carefully about what he says about himself and what he does. But be careful, read between the lines. He's an interesting writer. It is worth comparing what he says about the similar events in the secret history, but the secret history is what it is, and it needs to be treated with a bit of caution.
And that brings us nicely to the end of the podcast. Chris, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
I've enjoyed it, thank you.
And if you at home enjoyed today's podcast and want to find out more about the work we do, get in touch via our social media outlets. You can follow us on Facebook, www.facebook.com/Classical Youth Society Ireland. You could follow us on Twitter @CYSI_. If you want to get in contact directly, you can email us, cysiofficial@gmail.com. This series of Conversing the Classics was made possible by the Classical Association of Ireland, and today's episode was edited by Michael Fuller. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you all next time.